Elias stepped off the bus with a heavy heart, carrying only a small bag and the burden of years spent in service. The streets of his hometown looked unchanged but felt entirely foreign. Familiar shops lined the roads, and the air carried the scent of fresh bread from the old bakery on the corner. Yet something was absent. The sense of belonging he once cherished had vanished. He'd been gone so long that home now seemed like a distant memory rather than a source of comfort. People passed him by, absorbed in their own lives, while he stood frozen, uncertain of where he belonged anymore. His house stood as he'd left it, but stepping inside brought no peace. Dust coated the walls, and silence filled every corner. Echoes of his past haunted him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The laughter of his youth, the warmth of his parents' presence, and the simplicity of those days were now just faded pictures in his mind. He set his bag on the worn-out couch and sat, staring at the walls as if they held answers. The world had moved forward while he'd been away, but he remained caught between what once was and what now existed. Restlessness gripped him in the days that followed. The stillness of civilian life gnawed at him, leaving an emptiness inside. The disciplined rhythm of his past had dissolved, replaced by endless hours of uncertainty. He roamed the streets, hoping something familiar would spark a sense of connection. The city had shifted in ways he hadn't foreseen. New buildings stood where old ones once did, and unfamiliar faces crowded the sidewalks. He passed shops he'd once known, now owned by strangers. The overwhelming feeling of being lost consumed him as he wandered into a quiet alley. His eyes caught a shadowed figure hunched near a garbage bin. At first, it seemed like a stray animal scavenging for scraps, but as he drew closer, his heart raced. The shape was unmistakable. A large bear, its ribs jutting beneath matted fur, stood feebly, sniffing through discarded waste. Its body quivered with exhaustion and hunger, its eyes dull and lifeless, as if hope had long deserted it. Elias felt an inexplicable pull toward the creature, a sensation he couldn't yet grasp. Something deep within him recognized the bear. Something in its movements, its posture, stirred a memory. His mind raced back to moments buried beneath years of service and struggle. It seemed impossible, yet every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary animal. He took a hesitant step forward, ignoring the stares of passers-by who hurried off, indifferent to the fate of a starving beast. The world had grown cold, but Elias couldn't turn away. He felt a bond, one that defied reason. The bear let out a faint whimper, so weak it barely reached him. The sight awakened something long dormant inside him. He knew pain, had witnessed suffering, but nothing had prepared him for this. The bear lifted its head slightly, and their eyes met. A flicker of recognition crossed the animal's face before it drooped again, too frail to move. Elias stood rooted, his breath trapped in his chest. He knew this bear. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt, sending a chill through him. The past he thought he'd escaped surged back in the form of this emaciated creature on the streets. Memories flooded him. The training, the bond, the moments they'd shared, flashing like fragments of a forgotten puzzle. This wasn't just any bear. This was Torin, the bear he'd trained, the companion he'd once held closest. A lump swelled in his throat as he stepped nearer, his heart pounding with shock and grief. How had Torin ended up like this? What had happened in the years they'd been apart? The answers eluded him, but one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away, not now, not after all they'd endured. Elias stood still, his body taut with emotions he could scarcely process. The world around him faded as he focused solely on the broken animal before him. He'd thought he was the one who'd lost everything, but now he saw he wasn't alone in his suffering. Torin had suffered too, and somehow, their paths had crossed again in the most improbable way. Fate had reunited them, but what came next remained unclear. One thing was undeniable. Elias couldn't ignore what he'd just witnessed. He couldn't tear his eyes from the frail, starving bear before him. The reality struck harder than he'd expected. This wasn't just a lost animal struggling to survive. This was Torin, the bear he'd once trained, the one he'd spent countless hours with, forging a bond stronger than words. Seeing Torin in such a pitiful state sent waves of guilt and sorrow crashing over him. He'd assumed, when he left for his next mission years ago, that Torin would be cared for. He'd never imagined finding him like this. Abandoned, starving, alone. Elias took another cautious step forward. Torin barely stirred, his body too weak to show aggression or recognition. His once mighty frame had withered into a fragile shell, his fur caked with dirt and scars. The image of the strong, proud bear Elias had known was now a distant echo. He swallowed hard, shoving aside the guilt clawing at him. This wasn't the time for regret. Torin needed help, and he had to uncover what had happened. Memories surged back. He recalled the first time he'd met Torin, a lively cub bursting with energy and curiosity. Training him had been a challenge, but it had also been one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. Torin had been more than an animal. He'd been a companion, a loyal friend through war and uncertainty. Their connection transcended commands and obedience. It was built on trust and mutual understanding. Now that same bear stood before him, barely clinging to life. Elias glanced at the people passing by. None stopped, none cared. Anger flared within him. How had Torin ended up like this? How had no one noticed or helped? He looked back at the bear, who'd given up searching for food and now lay against the cold pavement. Torin's breathing was shallow and uneven, his body trembling from exhaustion. Elias's chest tightened. He'd seen suffering before, but this was different, this was personal. Determined to find answers, he knelt a short distance away, careful not to startle the weakened bear. He needed to confirm what he already suspected. This was Torin. Studying the bear's features, he searched for clues. There it was, a scar near Torin's right eye, the same one from a training session years ago. Doubt vanished. This was his bear. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread from his meal. It wasn't much, but it was something. He placed it on the ground a few feet away, hoping Torin would take it. The bear barely moved. Elias's heart sank. He'd never seen Torin like this. Always strong, always vibrant. Seeing him now, barely able to lift his head, was almost unbearable. Determined to learn more, he stood and scanned the area for anyone who might know what had happened. A few shop owners lingered outside, chatting casually as if nothing unusual was occurring nearby. He approached the nearest one, an elderly man who'd been watching him curiously. Elias asked if he'd seen the bear before. The man sighed, shaking his head. He'd noticed the bear wandering the streets for weeks, scavenging from bins. No one knew its origins. Some assumed it had escaped, but no one had bothered to investigate. They'd simply let it suffer, like any other stray. Elias's jaw clenched. He couldn't fathom it. Torin, alone for weeks, struggling to survive while people passed by daily. The thought twisted his stomach. This wasn't just any bear. This was Torin, his Torin. He couldn't ignore it. He had to act. Turning back, he saw the bear hadn't moved, his body still trembling, his breathing faint. Determination surged through Elias. He couldn't erase the past or undo whatever had befallen Torin after he'd left, but he could change what happened next. He couldn't abandon him, not like this. He had to uncover who'd forsaken him, who'd torn him from the life he'd known. Above all, he had to help him before it was too late. Stepping closer, he knew this was just the beginning. He would save Torin, no matter the cost. A deep urgency gripped Elias as he stood before Torin. The bear's frail body quaked with each breath, his once powerful muscles reduced to bones beneath tangled fur. The sight filled Elias with sadness and rage. How could anyone let this happen? He'd trained Torin, fed him, cared for him like a brother, and now he was discarded like refuse. The thought was unbearable. Elias knew standing there in shock wouldn't help. He had to act. His first priority was getting Torin to safety, but how? He couldn't carry a full-grown bear through the streets alone. He needed help. Looking around, he saw only indifference. Passers-by had long stopped noticing. Even the old man he'd spoken to had resumed his routine. No one cared about a dying bear except him. His mind raced for solutions. His small apartment couldn't house a bear. Torin needed medical care, food, shelter, but first he had to move him. Stepping closer, Elias pulled more food from his pocket, a half-eaten sandwich from earlier. He placed it near Torin's mouth, watching intently. First, there was no response. Then, slowly, Torin sniffed the air, his nose twitching, his dull eyes flickering with a faint spark of awareness. Elias held his breath. After what felt like forever, Torin parted his cracked lips and took a weak bite. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. He was still fighting, still holding on. Hope surged in Elias. He had to move quickly. Spotting a small veterinary clinic nearby, he ran to it, shoving the door open so hard the bell clanged wildly. Inside, a receptionist looked up, startled. Elias wasted no time, explaining the situation in rushed, urgent words. The woman hesitated. Wild animals weren't their specialty, but Elias wouldn't accept refusal. He pleaded for them to at least look. Reluctantly, a middle-aged vet followed him out. Seeing Torin, her face softened, hesitation replaced by concern. Kneeling at a safe distance, she confirmed what Elias knew. Torin was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and likely riddled with untreated injuries. Without help soon, he wouldn't survive. Elias clenched his fists, resolve blazing within him. He wouldn't let Torin die here. The vet made a call, speaking quietly. Soon, an animal rescue team arrived with a transport cage. They were wary, warning Elias that moving a bear, even a weak one, wouldn't be simple. But Elias knew Torin. He knew how to speak, how to move, how to calm him. Stepping forward, he used the same steady voice from years past. Torin's tired eyes locked onto his, recognition faint but clear. The bear let out a shuddering breath and, with immense effort, shifted forward. Took everything he had, but he trusted Elias. Slowly, painfully, Torin crawled into the cage. The rescuers watched, stunned. They'd never seen anything like it. When Torin was secured, Elias exhaled, relief washing over him. The fight was far from over. Torin was safe for now, but questions lingered. What had happened after Elias left? Who had abandoned him? Would he recover? Elias had no answers, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't leave Torin's side again. He'd failed him once, he wouldn't fail him now. He followed the rescue team as they transported Torin to a nearby rehabilitation center. The vehicle jolted over uneven roads, but Torin remained still, exhausted beyond measure. Elias sat by the cage, watching his old companion struggle to keep his eyes open. Every breath Torin took seemed a battle, and it pained Elias to see him so diminished. The van reached the facility, a modest place on the city's edge. It wasn't the grand sanctuary Torin deserved, but it was safe, warm, and staffed with professionals who could help. As the team opened the cage, they moved cautiously. Even weakened, Torin was still a bear, and trust came hard. But Elias was different. He crouched, extending his hand, letting Torin catch his scent. The bear's tired eyes met his. No aggression, no fear, just recognition. A silent understanding beyond words. It was as if Torin knew Elias had returned for him after everything. With slow, careful steps, Torin moved forward, his paws dragging slightly. The staff guided him inside, settling him into a large space with fresh water and soft bedding. The vet approached Elias, her face grave. She explained Torin was severely underweight, dehydrated, and battling infections, his condition critical. Had they found him later, he might not have made it. Elias swallowed hard. Losing Torin now, after finding him again, was unthinkable. He demanded to know what could be done. The vet assured him they'd provide nutrition, treatment, and constant care. But recovery hinged on more than medicine. Torin needed strength, the will to fight. Elias refused to leave. He sat by Torin's enclosure for hours, watching the team clean his wounds and hydrate him. Memories flooded back. He'd met Torin as a spirited cub, training him through challenges that forged an unbreakable bond. Torin had been his companion in the toughest times, and now he fought for survival. Days passed, and Elias stayed close, watching Torin regain strength bit by bit. At first he barely moved, but then he ate, drank, lifted his head. When Torin took his first real step in the enclosure, hope stirred in Elias for the first time in years. The staff marveled at their connection. Something unique, as if Torin knew Elias had returned for him, fueling his fight. Elias spent hours talking to him softly, recounting their past. Torin would tilt his head at certain words, his eyes tracking Elias with familiarity. But Elias knew this was only a start. Torin needed more than temporary care, a permanent home where he could live free from abandonment. Having seen too much loss, Elias wouldn't let Torin become another casualty. Determined, he made calls to sanctuaries, rescue groups, anyone who could help. He'd fight for Torin no matter what. He wouldn't let Torin's fate rest on chance. The bear had suffered enough. Elias spent every waking hour at the center, ensuring Torin ate, drank, and grew stronger. The vets had treated his wounds and infections, but his future remained uncertain. He couldn't stay there forever. Without a permanent solution, he'd face captivity elsewhere. Elias couldn't accept that. Torin deserved freedom, not another cage. Night after night, he researched sanctuaries, contacted organizations, sent emails. Most were full or reluctant to take a bear with such a past, seeing him as just a lost animal. But Elias saw his old friend, a soul who'd endured unimaginable hardship and survived. Weeks passed, and Torin improved. His dull eyes now sparked with awareness, his steps steadier. He began responding to Elias's voice, nudging his hand through the bars, a faint echo of his former self. One evening, after another long day, Elias got a call. A renowned sanctuary in the northern mountains had heard Torin's story. Specializing in rehabilitating abused animals, they offered him a permanent home after reviewing his case. Elias could hardly believe it. This was the breakthrough he'd sought. But there was a catch. Torin had to be transported across the country, a complex task requiring medical clearance, permits, and an experienced team. Elias didn't care how hard it was, he'd come too far to stop. He met with sanctuary representatives, completed the paperwork, and ensured every detail was perfect. Torin's future depended on it. The transfer day arrived. The center staff, attached to Torin, felt a quiet sadness as they prepared him. For Elias, this wasn't goodbye. It was a new beginning. As the team guided Torin into the transport cage, Elias stood by, speaking softly, promising safety. The journey was tense. Elias followed in a separate vehicle, heart pounding with every bump, unable to relax until Torin reached his new home. When they arrived, Elias was awestruck. The sanctuary sprawled across miles. Rolling hills, dense forests, open meadows. Everything he dreamed for Torin. The staff unloaded him carefully, guiding him to an enclosed area to adjust. Elias watched anxiously, hoping Torin wouldn't panic. Then something remarkable happened. As Torin stepped onto the grass, he paused, nose twitching, taking in the wild scent. He looked around, as if realizing he was free. Slowly, he took his first steps. Not hesitant, not fearful, just calm. Steady strides toward a future nearly lost. A lump formed in Elias's throat. Torin was home, finally where he belonged. Elias knew he couldn't stay forever, but he didn't need to. Torin was safe. He'd done what he came to do. As he turned to leave, a low rumble sounded behind him. Glancing back, he saw Torin watching, still, eyes fixed on him. Not with sadness or fear, but understanding. Elias smiled, nodded once. A silent farewell, and walked away, knowing everything was as it should be. Elias stood at the sanctuary's edge, hands on the wooden fence, watching Torin take slow steps across the open land. The bear's large paws pressed into the damp earth, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar sense of his new home. The sight should have brought relief, but a strange emptiness settled in Elias. For weeks, his world had revolved around saving Torin. Now, with the bear safe, the weight of what came next pressed on him. Torin had survived against all odds, but Elias had fought his own battles too. Returning home had left him adrift, as if he no longer fit anywhere. Yet, watching the bear who'd once been his closest companion, he realized something. Perhaps he'd needed to find Torin as much as Torin had needed him. The staff gave him space for a final moment alone. Wind rustled the trees, carrying pine and grass scents. Torin paused, tilting his head as if sensing Elias. He turned, their eyes locking once more. No desperation, pain, or confusion, just peace. An ache bloomed in Elias's chest. This was goodbye. Torin had relied on him to survive, but he no longer needed saving. He belonged here, far from the cruelty of those who'd used and discarded him. Elias had done all he could. Now it was time to let go. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back. Torin watched, still eyes tracking him. The moment stretched, unspoken yet heavy with meaning. Words felt useless, so Elias nodded. A silent farewell. Torin exhaled slowly, then turned, walking deeper into the sanctuary. Elias watched until he vanished into the trees, his massive form blending into the wild. He'd never forget this, the final piece of their journey. The director approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "He's going to be okay," she said softly. Elias nodded. "I know." The drive home was quiet, the road stretching endlessly, but for the first time in years he didn't feel lost. He'd returned to this town without purpose, but now he'd found something worth fighting for. Torin had survived because Elias refused to give up, but it wasn't just about Torin. Countless animals suffered the same fate. Abandoned, forgotten. Pulling into his driveway, Elias sat in his car, staring at the sky. His life had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. The weight of his past felt lighter. He'd found a reason to move forward. Though Torin was no longer beside him, their bond endured. Stepping inside, setting down his keys, the silence no longer suffocated. It wasn't an end, it was a new start. Elias didn't slip back into his old routine, he couldn't. Something had changed. The weeks spent fighting for Torin had opened his eyes to a reality he couldn't ignore. Too many animals like Torin, forgotten, abused, discarded when no longer useful. He'd spent years in the military seeking justice, but now he saw it was needed elsewhere too. He started small, researching, calling, connecting with animal rescue groups. He shared Torin's story online, hoping to raise awareness. At first, it felt futile, but then people responded. Messages flooded in from strangers moved by Torin's journey, offering help, sharing their own rescue tales, asking how to join. Elias hadn't expected it, but it gave him purpose. He began volunteering at a local wildlife center, aiding animals recovering from injury and neglect. It differed from his structured past, but it felt just as meaningful. He'd once trained Torin to survive a harsh world. Now he gave others a second chance. Visits to Torin's sanctuary became routine. Every few months, he'd make the trip, bringing donations, watching Torin roam freely. The first time he saw him splashing in a stream like a carefree cub, something broke inside Elias. The bear once near death was now thriving, proof he'd chosen right. Torin always recognized him. Even as seasons changed and scars faded, he never forgot. Each visit, he'd lift his head, watching with deep, knowing eyes. No grand reunions, no fanfare. Their bond, forged in trust and survival, needed no words. The director once said Torin was lucky, that most animals with his past wouldn't have survived. But Elias knew it wasn't just luck. It was resilience. Torin had endured because he never gave up, and in saving him, Elias had rediscovered his own fight. As years passed, Torin became a symbol of hope. His story spread through articles, documentaries, and campaigns. People came from afar to see him, to learn about animal exploitation and rehabilitation's importance. Elias shunned recognition, but seeing Torin strong in the wild made it all worthwhile. One afternoon, sitting by the sanctuary fence, watching Torin rest under a tree, Elias realized something. Torin had been a soldier too, trained, disciplined, bound to a duty not his own. Like Elias, he'd been cast into a world that took everything. Yet he'd found his way back. Elias smiled, leaning against the fence. Torin was home, and, for the first time in ages, so was he. Years passed, But the memory of finding Torin starving on the streets never dimmed. It had been a turning point, not just for the bear, but for Elias. He'd gone from lost and detached to finding a purpose beyond himself. He'd once thought soldiers fought only on battlefields, but battles raged everywhere. Injustice, neglect, cruelty. Sometimes the most unexpected souls needed saving. Torin thrived in his new home. Each visit confirmed Elias's choice. The once broken creature became a symbol of survival, resilience's power. His story grew bigger than a trained bear and a soldier. It proved kindness, loyalty, and second chances could transform lives. Elias had feared returning home meant losing purpose, but through Torin, he found something deeper. He dedicated his life to animal welfare, ensuring no creature suffered Torin's fate. He worked with organizations, spoke publicly, fought for protections against exploitation. He never saw himself as a hero, but each animal given a second chance brought quiet fulfillment. One evening, by the sanctuary fence, watching Torin rest under the sunset's glow, Elias exhaled deeply. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it was worth every step. Torin was more than a bear. He was a teacher, a friend, a reminder that no one, human or animal, was beyond saving. Their story touched hearts worldwide, showing compassion could heal the deepest wounds. Elias wanted to spread that message. If it moved you, if you believe in second chances and loyalty's power, join the cause. Together we can build a world where no soul, man or beast, is left behind. Elias gave Torin one last look, a silent promise passing between them. The battle was won, but the fight for others like him was just beginning.